if we keep improving technology at the rate, at the pace that we've been improving it, then eventually we're going to get to a point where we can cure all disease and even old age. So transhumanism, that's part of it, and specifically extropianism. Think of bionic eyes to improve your vision, or maybe you can back up your thoughts in the cloud, and then if you forget something, you can... Any type of technology that would be used to upgrade humans itself, and eventually this would allow people, humans, to colonize space.
Welcome back to the next episode in our podcast series with Aaron van Wirdum, the author of the Genesis book. Today we're going to talk about the Extropians, transhumanism, and the high-tech Hayekians. Welcome back, Aaron.
Thanks.
Let's start with Max O'Connor. Let's talk about him.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us who he was, what the significance of his contributions are, why he matters.
Yeah, so Max, his original name was Max O'Connor. He was he grew up in Great Britain, and at some point he went to the United States, to California, to get his PhD, I believe. And he had always been interested in, even as a kid, he'd been interested in sort of expanding the human potential. He had sort of this vision, sort of a science fiction type of vision for the future, where humans would sort of upgrade itself in a way. Now in England, this wasn't a very popular idea. He was kind of alone in these kinds of thoughts. He didn't really find, peers that had a similar vision. But when he got to the United States, in California in particular, he found a very different type of, atmosphere, culture, a culture of builders and visionaries and people that indeed believed in a greater future and how to build that. And specifically, he came in contact with the work of someone called FM 2030. That was not his original name. His original name was an Iranian name that I don't remember what the exact name was, but he called himself FM 2030. And he was spreading this idea about basically transhumanism, the idea of eternal life specifically. What FM 2030 specifically predicted was that humanity would, as technology would continue to improve and develop at an exponential rate, right? You use technology to improve other technology, and technology is better and better in an exponential rate historically. And he thought, if you kind of draw that line forward, if we keep improving technology at the rate, at the pace that we've been improving it, then eventually we're going to get to a point where we can cure all disease and even old age. So we're getting to a point where you humans have an indefinite lifespan. You don't die of any disease or old age anymore. You can just keep living. So that's an idea that FM 2030 was spreading, that Max O'Connor, as he was still called, was very interested in. Although around this time he changed his name. So he changed his name from Max O'Connor to Max More. He wanted to be an author eventually, and this is something that more Californian authors were doing. So he changed his name to Max More, and it sort of embedded his optimistic outlook.
Ethos. Let me read a quote from him.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed to really encapsulate the essence of what my goal is, always to improve, never to be static. I was going to get better at everything, become smarter, fitter, and healthier. It would be a constant reminder to keep moving forward. I like that.
Yeah, exactly. So he got in contact with the ideas of FM 2030. At this time, these ideas seemed, kind of science fiction-y still.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, there was also K. Eric Drexler, and he wrote the book Engines of Creation. And in that book, he explored a vision of micro robots,
nanoparticles,
nanotechnology, indeed, and which also include nano robots. And he thought this would completely change the world. So basically, robots made out of molecules, so they're super small robots, and these could be used for all kinds of things. They could be used to clear the air of pollution. But they could also be used to enter the human body and find, cancer cells, for example, or just clean, any damage that it can find in a body. These robots would be able to fix. So FM 2030 was sort of describing this vision in a kind of abstract way. Like he just sort of saw, okay, technology has been improving at this rate. If we keep going, then we'll get to this point. NK Eric Drexler actually sort of showed a way that could actually be done with this nanotechnology. Max Moore, as he was now called, he became acquainted with these ideas, and he started to develop a vision around it, a philosophy. And this is called transhumanism. That's part of it, and specifically extropianism. But let's stick to transhumanism first. So the idea there, and it's based on humanism. So the idea that, the human being is sort of a central point of meaning rather than like a god or anything like that. Like it was sort of a non-religious form of, religion or it places humans at the heart of meaning. And transhumanism is an evolution of that. So what Max Moore foresaw is that humanity as a species would ultimately transform itself. So there would be a upgraded version of humanity that indeed has infinite lifespans, but you can also think of, bionic eyes to improve your vision, or maybe you can back up your thoughts in the cloud, and then if you forget something, you can, or just microchips to have your brain function better, or any type of technology that would be used to upgrade humans itself. And eventually this would allow humans to colonize the space. You go to different planets, adjust your body in such a way that you can live on the planet. Maybe you breathe something different. Yeah. Maybe you have a different way of dealing with gravity, like whatever it is, that humans would learn to upgrade themselves, live forever, and explore space.
I think it's important to point out that a lot of these ideas from 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, right? So this was, 30, 40, 50 years ago that they were talking about all these things. And I think if you play this forward in time, just talking about, for example, the human lifespan, right? For most of human history, the human lifespan was like, 30s, right? You lived to about 30 years old. That was considered old age. Now it's, 80, right? And I think as technology gets better and better, and to their credit, a lot of these things, they're working on a lot of stuff in the field of aging, and they're figuring out Yamanaka factors and all sorts of different things that could potentially expand human lifespan even much further than 80 years old. From nanotechnology and micro-targeting, a lot of these technologies are being developed, right? Elon Musk is working on Neuralink, right? Which is a chip that plugs into the brain.
Yeah.
I've seen some cool stuff with contact lenses that, overlay certain dynamics. So a lot of fascinating things here that these guys were talking about 50 years ago that do indeed, you're starting to see the early seeds of some of these things form. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. You could see these guys as really sort of pioneers in this field.
Yeah.
Like, and the important, by the way, one footnote on what you said. So the average human lifespan used to be much lower, but that's also because children died
true.
way more often. So that sort of got the average down. Like, even if you go back to, Roman times, then if you made it past a certain age, you would on average get, to your 60s, 70s, 80s. But, we're obviously getting better at keeping people alive these days, including older people. So average lifespan has increased, but not by like 50 years. That's also not. But in any case, the transhumanists, they believe that, moving forward, we would just keep improving this. And they were sort of the pioneers of this field. So nowadays, indeed, some of these ideas have become more popular or mainstream, or more people are talking about it, but they were pretty early. What's interesting, or what's important to note there, is that some of these ideas existed like in the realm of science fiction, of course. Like there were science fiction stories where these kinds of things were existed, whether it's comic books or movies, or like the ideas weren't completely original. But what's new was that these guys were really taking the idea seriously and saw it as a realistic prospect to achieve within our own lifetimes, essentially, or within their own lifetimes. So FM 2030, his name 2030 referred to the year where he predicted that lifespans would indeed become indefinite. So if you make it to 2030, he said, then you can just live forever if you want. He sort of predicted that as sort of a year where
they really are making a lot of progress in this field.
Longevity,
yeah. With the telomere length thing, and as cells age, they start to have more mutations and problems. But they figured out a way to reverse this, to start to reverse this process in cells, and almost reverse age the cells back to close to their stem cell state. But there's a lot of progress on this front, and 2030 might be a little early, but I think he's on the right track here in a lot of ways from science and the studies and things I'm looking at.
Yeah, I don't suspect we'll make it to indefinite lifespans in 6 years from now, but well, there's been progress indeed.
There's definitely been progress, yeah.
So where was I? Yeah, so he developed transhumanism really as a sort of philosophy, as something to aspire to. And what he wanted to achieve with that in part was he was an atheist, Max Moore. So he thought that he was not religious, and he kind of wanted to replace religion in a way. So his thinking was science has to a large extent already been sort of chipping away at the stronghold of religion in society. But religion still serves a purpose of, giving people strength or hope in hard times or meaning in life. And he wanted to replace that as well. So he wanted to offer people a different, ideal to live for. So another reason to, think life is worth living and to keep at it. So that was one of the reasons he developed this philosophy. Now here we can make the jump to extropianism. So transhumanism is sort of this basic idea of we're going to be able to upgrade ourselves, or humans are going to be able to upgrade ourselves through technology. Now Max Moore did figure there's multiple ways of doing that. Like there's not one path to achieve that. And his specific path to achieving that was very Hayekian in a way. So he believed in the free market, and he believed that, letting the free market run its course, let people free to trade with whoever they want, whenever they want, is the best way to actually achieve this vision. So around this vision, he founded Extropians. I mentioned some of the other science fiction stories, like, you can just point to Star Trek, for example. Star Trek is a good example. Now, in Star Trek, there's all this, it's sort of this utopian future based around all kinds of new technologies that have been invented. But in Star Trek, humanity is mostly managed by some sort of benevolent, well-intentioned global government that sort of leads humanity on its path. Now, Max Moore did not believe in that. He, as mentioned, he was inspired by Hayek's work. So he believed the best way to achieve that was to allow the free market to figure it out. So if you just let people, if you let spontaneous order emerge,
back to that concept.
Yes, exactly. Then automatically, or at least through the free market, technology would develop to that point. So it was a big. He tried to get the government out of people's lives. And he started a movement around that. So it was a transhumanist movement, and it was kind of a subculture within the transhumanist movement called extropianism.
So,
and this, go on.
I was just going to say that, extropy, the concept of that was, Morrow coined the term extropy, serving as an antonym of entropy, the process of degradation, of running down. Extropy stood for improvement and growth, even infinite growth. Those who, like Max Moore and Tom Morrow, ascribed to this transhumanist vision be regarded as extropians.
Right. Yeah, so Max Moore at that point, along with a friend of his originally named Tom Bell, and then he renamed himself to Tom Morrow. So they have Max Moore and Tom Morrow. and they founded the Extropians, and specifically they started Extropy magazine. So this was a magazine. I believe the first issue was published in 1989. Like always, I might be off with a year or two, but I think it's 1989. And in this,
actually have a lot of. I printed some of these.
Oh yeah, nice. Yeah, you found a bunch of them. Where online? Different. I would assume.
Yeah, I found the PDFs, and from spread out over different years, from 1996, 1993. Just a couple editions that I thought were really interesting.
What years did you say?
If you look at the bottom, it'll show you some are from 96, some are from 93.
We'll get to this in a bit.
Yeah.
In the article. Yeah.
But you can really see.
So there's, I think there were like 30 magazines in total printed, something like this. Maybe less, maybe like 20.
I'm gonna have to try to track them all down.
I think there was one every quarter. I think it was a quarterly magazine. I mean, I do have all of them. The digital versions, I should say.
So I don't. Here it says in the fall of 1988, the first edition was published.
88, right? Fall of 88. Okay. Yeah. So now there was this magazine that would publish these kinds of ideas. So indeed, we're talking about mind uploading. We're talking about nanotechnology. We're talking about asteroid mining, space colonization. Another interesting one to mention is, of course, cryopreservation. Should we get there?
Yeah, cryonics. Let's talk about it.
Yeah. So the general idea, of course, was that eventually humanity would reach the point of indefinite lifespans. FM 2030 predicted in 2030. Now, they expected this to happen within their own lives, more or less. But of course, it can happen that you die before this is available. Now, that's particularly annoying.
You're right on the cusp, right?
Yeah, you're almost there, right? Mm-hmm. So let's say you die 10 years before indefinite lifespans are achieved. So now there's a difference of 10 years between just dying, like every human has ever did until that point, or living forever and being part of this amazing future with space colonization and indefinite lifespans and, name it. It's only 10 years, so that's really stumbling before the finish line. So the sort of stopgap solution that the Extropians also came up with was cryonics. So essentially, you have either your whole body or your head frozen if you pass away as soon as possible, and then preserved. And then the assumption is technology will keep developing, technology will keep improving, scientists will get smarter and smarter, and at some point in the future, they'll reach the point where they can revive you and cure whatever disease got the best of you. So this is a concept that actually exists. There's a lot of the Extropians that passed away so far have actually cryopreserved their bodies. So there's this facility there's a couple. One of them in Arizona, I believe one of them in Russia, and maybe two in China. I'm pretty sure that's it, but maybe there's maybe I'm off. I think that's it. And they are actually preserving these bodies and heads, and waiting for science and technology to catch up and see if they can revive these bodies.
Super interesting. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a cool Netflix documentary about it when it happens.
That's for sure. There is a mockumentary about it, actually, or at least a fake documentary about FM 2030 in particular. Mm-hmm. I think you can find it on YouTube. I don't remember the name of the documentary. I did see it. It's a bit weird, but it is kind of interesting. But yeah, it's like I think in the documentary they are going to revive him. So it's like the technology is now done and they're going to revive him, and it's shot kind of like a documentary.
Interesting.
It's I think it's like 25 minutes long or so. But it's also kind of just a profile about FM 2030 and kind of an exploration of his ideas and of this cryopreservation in particular.
Let me comment real quick just to tie in some of the previous episodes we had. This concept of extropianism, this wasn't just, these fringe people. We spoke about cryptographers like Ralph Merkle, who also subscribed to this magazine. famous physicists like Richard Feynman also subscribed to this magazine. So this wasn't just super fringe. There were, people who were highly intelligent in different fields that were also, subscribers and believers in this concept, right? So what they shared in common was a science-based optimism about the future. With Extropy, they finally had a magazine to learn about the most radically futurist ideas out there, or they could share their own radical ideas as guest contributors.
Yeah, indeed. So there's a whole bunch of people that contributed in one way or another to the magazine. And you already mentioned some well-known names. Of course, there's also a bunch of well-known names now because they were part of the early digital cash movement. But
let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about the high-tech Hayekians. I printed out some of the Extropy articles that had a lot to do with digital cash and this concept of a non-government money, and that take a lot of Hayek's later ideas. I think what was his famous book that he finally wrote was the denationalization of money, I believe.
We discussed that in an earlier episode, right?
Yeah,
That was Hayek's one.
We touched on it very briefly, but that was, I think, one of his later works later on in his life, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So, and I think that really fed into this. There was a lot of influence there from those ideals and concepts that influenced a lot of the people who contributed to the Extropy magazine when it came to digital cash, or the high-tech Hayekians.
Yeah, well, these are two slightly different things. So you had indeed the high-tech Hayekians, and they were basically Extropians.
Mm-hmm.
So this included Phil Salin, K. Eric Drexler,
Miller, I think.
Mark Miller, yeah.
Mark Miller, yeah.
And Mark Miller and K. Eric Drexler were working on Xanadu, which was an early hypertext project. So hypertext is, what you use on the web to click a link and you get to another web page. Actually, before that was invented, they were already working on a project like that for the internet, for computers, called Xanadu. And that remained a work in progress for a long time before it was finally abandoned, I believe in the 90s or maybe even the 2000s. But for a long time, that was sort of this big promising, alternative to the web, essentially, alternative to the World Wide Web. They had the Xanadu project, which was it was going to be like a competitor to that. But they published a couple of papers, and they in these papers they described how computers could over the internet help each other essentially by sharing computing power. So if I want to make some computations, and your computer is not you're not on your computer right now, then I can use your computer to make my computations, right? So in that sense, there would be a more efficient use of computing resources anywhere, because computing resources could always be used by other computers. Now, the way this would be managed is through trade. So you would pay each other over the internet to use each other's computing power, essentially. And this was all based on Hayek's ideas. So these were technologists. They were developing, a computer software, but they were basing this very strongly on Hayek's ideas of free market and how and explaining it in these terms. So explaining in Hayek's free market terms why a market for computing power would lead to the most efficient use of computing resources in this case. So they were the high tech Hayekians, and they were also Extropians. Mm-hmm. So you can see that the Extropians indeed had this very sort of Hayekian culture to it. They had this very Hayekian approach to achieving their goals. Now, maybe the other thing you wanted to get to is digital cash. So the Extropians also got interested in digital cash. They started with specifically Hal Finney. We'll meet him later on in other episodes as well, if we haven't mentioned him yet. But Hal Finney, as we now of course know, was the first Bitcoin user besides after Satoshi. And Hal Finney was also an Extropian. And I think most listeners will also know that Hal Finney has by now passed away, and his body is being cryopreserved. So Hal Finney, he was an Extropian, and he started to promote the idea of digital cash to the Extropians. At first, this was in the context of privacy. So we mentioned, Chaum's idea of digital cash, and that was mostly what Halvini was thinking of. Like that's sort of the context that he was talking about and thinking of digital cash. And he was emphasizing the importance of privacy. So again, the Extropians want to keep the government out of their lives. They were libertarians. They were, Hayekians. They want to keep the government out of their lives. And Halvini started to explain why then it is important to have a digital form of cash where people can pay each other anonymously. So the government doesn't necessarily know who's paying who or who owns what, etc. So that is sort of the argument that he was putting forward at first. He was explaining digital cash is important for privacy reasons. But the Extropians then got very interested in this idea. So Halvini sort of got his way. Oh, by the way, Nick Szabo, who also, also, of course, one of the classic forefathers of Bitcoin, was also an Extropian. And a couple more. Tim May was also.
Tim May.
Yeah. I guess we'll get to that in the next episode. But yeah, bunch of these.
Let's talk about Phil Salen a little bit, because I think he played a role in all this. And unfortunately, he passed very young, I think, right in the early 90s. But he was, a lot of his ideas were way ahead of his time. I mean, he was almost just in the he was in the just wrong place at the wrong time, I guess, like, because his ideas were, so revolutionary. And I think he predicted so many different things that really played out. He really was just insanely intelligent. And he had this idea for these online marketplaces, and I think it was his idea to have reputation systems. And I think was it Amix was the marketplace of ideas he wanted to form. But I think that the way he wanted to set it up and this idea of a reputation system, I think that played a huge role in how many of these other marketplaces formed later on. And then him and Tim May kind of had different ideas. Can we talk about that just a little bit? I know that's kind of niche, but
yeah, so Phil Salen was one of the Extropians, so he died. He passed away very early, so right around the time that Extropians were founded. But he's definitely, at least like spiritually, he was an Extropian. He had the same type of mindset. And he also founded a private space company, like long before, like we're talking like the 80s, 90s, long before Elon Musk, or long before this was sort of considered a viable thing. Even he founded a private space launch company, and I believe he had 2 rockets that he actually did launch successfully. However, he found that it was practically impossible to compete with the NASA's.
Yeah, I think I actually recently read a book about Elon, and he talks a lot about this, about how just terribly mismanaged and how much money is spent on all these things, and just the economic incentive misalignments with these the traditional companies that NASA funds, and how Elon was coming in and just like totally blowing them out of the water for cost. But just in order to get the deals and the contracts, is just so much inefficient waste. Well, so the game theory was just against him, but Phil Salen pointed this out as well.
So Phil Salen had the opposite conclusion, actually. So he found that it was impossible to compete with the space shuttle, because the space shuttle was tax funded, by NASA, and therefore, for a private company to compete with that, it was impossible, because the cost of using the space shuttle, because it was taxpayer funded, was just not something that he could compete with. But he believed that was ultimately holding, space development back, because there was no free market in that era or in that area. It was limited. It limited how much competition there could be, and therefore how much innovation there could be. So he was against the space shuttle for that reason. But ultimately, his company failed. It was called Starstruck, I believe, the company. Yeah. And then, but he had another idea, which was AMX. So AMIX was going to be a marketplace for the internet where people could buy and sell information. And what he foresaw that this would achieve and again, keep in mind, this is long before eBay. This is long before like any of Amazon.
Yeah.
Long before any of these existed.
This is why I want to talk about him, because, you know, this was now these, of course, you just accept that the internet has all of these types of marketplaces and things, but this was like, you know, this was like pre-90s, right? This was like the 80s, right? This is so long ago.
Yeah, he was way ahead of his time.
And way ahead of his time, yeah.
So he developed a marketplace for information, and what he foresaw that would actually achieve is it would push down transaction costs. And transaction costs in this context means any cost you make to make a transaction. So this would include, for example, if you want to buy a specific bottle of wine, then you would first have to figure out at which wine store they sell this wine, which would take time. Like I have to research different wine stores, call them up, whatever you did at that time, you know, go in a phone book, figure it out. And then only after or drive from one wine store to another one. And then at some point you might find that bottle of wine. But all this research comes at a cost, right?
Time.
So getting this actual bottle of wine would be more expensive than the price on the bottle. There's also cost involved in, you know, getting the bottle in the first place, also just driving there and etc. So Phil Salin, that's a very basic type of information that he thought could be for sale on a marketplace like that. Like you would post a message that says, "Hey, if you tell me at what store I can find this specific brand of wine, I'll give you $5." And then presumably someone whose time is worth less in that sense would do the research and just tell you and get the $5. So now I'm happy because I could spend my time on better things that are more valuable to me than the $5. Well, for someone else, the $5 is more valuable than their time to research it. So we both win, plus the wine store wins because they're selling more wine, presumably. So it would push back transaction costs in that sense and benefit the free market. So Amex was really sort of supposed to improve free market processes in the broadest sense of the word. So that's what Phil Salin came up with, and he did develop it, which, again, as you point out, was quite the feat because, you know, even the web wasn't there. Even websites didn't exist yet.
This is pre-internet, you know, kind of thing. It's like fascinating.
I mean, it's not pre-internet, but basically it's pre-internet. Yeah,
before anybody could really use it. You know?
Yeah, so he had to develop the whole thing from scratch. He had to develop payment systems, reputation systems, the marketplace itself, ways for people to reach each other. Like he had to develop the whole thing, and he did. So it did exist. But even then, you developed something that's technically super innovative at a time where people don't even have the internet or computers yet.
He was so far ahead of his time.
Yeah, so it didn't really take off. Presumably for that reason, it was just a classic example of, you know, a good idea ahead of its time.
Yeah, exactly. In short, more trade means a better allocation of resources across the economy, spontaneous order. So kind of just to tie that back in with his high-tech Hayekian thought process, right? So I think he was just way, like we said, way ahead of his time. But unfortunately, you know, he died very young. But I think had he lived longer, he would have just eaten up the internet in its current state and probably provided a lot more cool ideas and
who knows? I mean, it was a brilliant mind. There's no doubt about that.
Was David Chaum part of the Extropians?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay,
no.
I was curious. So you mentioned Hal Finney a little bit. I'm just going to read it. We can talk more about him later, but I'm going to read one of his quotes. "We are on a path today, which if nothing changes, will lead to a world with the potential for greater government power, intrusion, and control. We can change this. These technologies can revolutionize the relationship between individuals and organizations, putting them both on an equal footing for the first time. Cryptography can make possible a world in which people have control over information about themselves, not because government has granted them that control, but because only they possess the cryptographic keys to reveal that information." So back to Hal Finney. He was, and from my reading it, he wasn't an extreme anarchist or anything like that. He was much more pragmatic and rational, but he had just this great sense of optimism. about the future, right? That's why he was always willing to try all these digital cash implementations.
Okay, so Helvini, he proposed digital cash in one of the Extropian magazines, and you printed it out.
Mm-hmm.
So indeed, protecting privacy with electronic cash. So his point here was specifically about privacy, as I mentioned. And he kind of explained to other Extropians how it worked, why they should care, what it was, etc. Public key cryptography, anonymous these are different topics he points out. But yeah, so he was mostly interested for the privacy perspective. But what this did was it introduced the idea of electronic cash within Extropian circles. And then a couple of years later, and I see you've printed this out as well, which is awesome. A couple of years later, I believe like 2 years later, the Extropians had a new magazine, so a new Extropian magazine. And this was basically entirely based on, or what's the right way to put it? It was like every article
was
more
about
or less
digital cash and this high-tech Hayekian kind of denationalization of money principles, right?
Yeah, so it's themed was the word I was looking for. It was an entire magazine themed around digital cash. So indeed, you have here an article, Introduction to Digital Cash by Mark Grant, Thoughts on the Economics of Digital Money by Lawrence H. White, which was one of the major proponents of free banking. So that's sort of what Hayek, of course, also proposed. And then you had George Selgin and Lawrence White became kind of two of the main proponents of that. One of them, Lawrence White, wrote an article for this magazine. And then also there was a review of Selgin's work in the same magazine.
And he wrote Selgin was free banking. I think a book about free banking. Is that him?
Yeah, Selgin was a free banker. The name of his book, the title of his book, is that what you're asking?
I think it was, yeah. I don't remember.
Yeah, the theory of free banking, maybe?
Something like that,
yeah. And Max Moore, he wrote an entire article on the denationalization of money. So Hayek's work. Now,
let's talk about that.
Yeah. So, what do you mean? Do you want to get back to Hayek's ideas about that, or?
Yeah, let's talk about Hayek's, because again, that was responsible for a lot of this, and Max Moore really dove into that. But just some quotes here from Hayek, Hayek's book, and some concepts. The fiat currency system was responsible for 4 economic ills: inflation, instability, undisciplined state expenditure, and economic nationalism. Inflation is caused by government expansion of the money supply and a Keynesian attempt to lower unemployment. More explained, but it actually distorts the economy, increases effective taxes, and has an addictive effect to boot. We spoke a lot about that in earlier chapters. Economic nationalism, or what Hayek had called monetary nationalism, furthermore unnecessarily affects different parts of the economy in unpredictable and detrimental ways. We talked a little bit about that. The monetary system enabled undisciplined state expenditure, More explained. Fiat currency helps grow the scope of government. The state expands its power largely through taking more of the wealth of productive individuals, wrote the Extropian. Taxation provides a means for funding new agencies, programs, and powers. Raising taxes generates little enthusiasm, so governments often turn to another means of finance, borrowing and expanding the money supply. So money printing allows the expansion of a lot of these different agencies, programs, and powers. What are your thoughts on this idea of undisciplined state expenditure?
So that ties in with the Cantillon effect. Cantillon, however I'm supposed to pronounce that. And also this idea, which like this Keynesian idea, of course, of spending is always going to be popular. So while Keynes, suggested that there should be this counter-cyclical approach, it's always going to be popular to spend. And if there's no limit on the money supply, then, why wouldn't governments just spend forever, which, to a large extent, we have seen happening. That there's always more spending, essentially. Now, the interesting thing here is indeed that Max Moore was inspired by Hayek, not just in the sense of that he wanted to realize this transhumanist vision through free markets. But now he also adopted this Hayekian idea on money. So while that was one of Hayek's ideas that was very forgotten almost. Even as Hayek's own ideas gained more popularity, his ideas on money were kind of ignored, right? We talked about the monetarists last time that for a large part did adopt Hayek's ideas on free markets, but not on money. Now, Max More, he now also gets interested in Hayek's ideas on money. So he started to explain that to the other extropians. He had this whole article on Hayek's denationalization of money, in which he explained why it would be a good thing if money is left to the free market. Now, the crucial thing, and that's why this chapter on the extropians is actually, it's kind of a pivotal chapter in the Genesis book. It's kind of a forgotten part of Bitcoin's prehistory, I think, that a lot of people don't know about. But I see the extropian movement is really where the two storylines sort of come together. So you had the people that wanted to create digital cash for privacy reasons, and you had people that wanted to reform money, the free bankers. And within the extropian community, they really start to meet. So indeed, you got Selgin and White. They were Lawrence White literally was publishing an article for in the Extropian magazine, and Halvini was writing about digital cash. And then now in this magazine, you got Max More, and his argument was digital cash technology is great. Hayek's ideas on monetary reform are great. Let's use this digital cash technology to accomplish this Hayekian idea of denationalizing money. So I think do you have this quote in front of you? It's a nice quote with a 1-2 punch.
Let's see here.
We can look it up real quick.
Yes, I do. Competing currencies will trump the present system by controlling inflation, maximizing the stability of dynamic market economies, restraining the size of government, and by recognizing the absurdity of the nation state, Moore wrote. Pairing this reform with the introduction of anonymous digital money would provide a potent 1-2 punch to the existing order. Digital cash, making it harder for governments to control and tax transactions.
Right. So indeed, you first had Schaum that just wanted to create digital cash for privacy reasons, and you had Hayek that wanted to reform money. And here in the extropian movement, it really comes together.
I think that's a good point to wrap this episode.
Let's do it.
All right.